When I finally saw her and met her briefly, I was frightened to death to ever ask her for a date.
There was something about Bill that when I went home that night, I definitely was convinced that if God would let me spend the rest of my life with him, I'd consider it a tremendous privilege.
For a moment, we are here together, and it hits me that this won't last forever. We can't own it, we just get to hold it for a while. This life.
Billy and Ruth Graham are together in heaven today. Mr. Graham passed away 1 year ago, and Ruth died in 2007. One of their longtime friends was also Billy Graham's executive assistant. His name is David Bruce, and he describes Billy and Ruth Graham's romance this way.
The story of Billy and Ruth Graham is a love story for the ages.
David Bruce is our guest on this episode of GPS, God, People, Stories. I'm Phil Fleischman. This is actually a repeat episode and one of our most popular episodes. It's become something of a tradition to post this episode on or around Valentine's Day.
This Valentine's week, by the way, I'm Jim Kirkland. We're going to do something a little bit different with this particular popular episode. We're including memories from Billy and Ruth Graham's granddaughter, Sissy Graham Lynch.
What I loved was that any time my grandmother walked into the room, my grandfather's blue eyes would twinkle and sparkle.
You're going to hear more from Sissy Graham Lynch later in this episode, and you're also going to hear more from Billy Graham himself.
Many reporters ask me, who is the greatest Christian I've ever known? I always answer, Ruth. She is the greatest Christian I've ever known.
What does it even mean to be a Christian? Well, it means you have surrendered control of your life to Jesus Christ. And we can tell you more about that at this website, findpeacewithgod.net. That site can also help you grow deeper in your faith if you're already a Christian. The address again is findpeacewithgod.net.
GPS. God. People. Stories.
Ruth Graham's maiden name was Bell. She was born in China in 1920. Her parents were missionaries.
Billy Graham, he was born 2 years earlier in Charlotte, North Carolina in 1918. His parents were farmers.
How would those two people meet from such different worlds? Well, they would meet in the fall of 1940 at Wheaton College. And it's a wonderful story about how both of them ended up there.
Wheaton is in Illinois, just outside of Chicago. Now, Billy Graham had already graduated from Florida Bible Institute. In 1940, he transferred to Wheaton to complete his preparation for ministry.
God had called him into ministry, and though he did not know at that time the shape or stripe or size of what that ministry would be, in fact, he assumed it would be a pastoral ministry, he followed his heart and the leadership of the Lord to Wheaton College. On the other side of the world, the Bell family had decided, Dr. and Mrs. Bell, to send their second daughter, Ruth Bell, to Wheaton College as well. They'd picked a college where the Bible was respected and taught with great authority.
So that's how Billy Graham and Ruth Bell ended up on the same campus in 1940. But how did they actually meet? It was a furniture truck. Billy Graham had taken a job with a friend of his, Johnny Streeter, loading and unloading this furniture truck.
Johnny had been telling his friend Billy about this young lady who had just recently come to the college by the name of Ruth Bell. One day, while they were working hard, standing there in sweaty clothes and working to get material off the back of the truck, suddenly Johnny said to him, "There is Ruth Bell." Mr. Graham said he turned and looked, and she was looking just straight at him. He said he was flustered, but he knew that was someone he had wanted to meet. From that moment, in the fall of 1940, he said it took him 1 month to muster the courage to ask her out on a date.
Their first date, says David, was to go hear the college choir's performance of Handel's Messiah.
On the night of their first date, when Mr. Graham took her to hear Handel's Messiah, he, of course, was just overwhelmed having the opportunity to be with this very special young lady who had been known on the campus for having such a godly and spiritual heart. They knew her to be one who wanted to be a missionary. You'll find it interesting to note that she would later say on that very same night, when she went back to her dorm room, she got down on her knees and told the Lord if she could spend the rest of her life serving Him with that young man she had been with that evening by the name of Billy Graham, she would consider it the greatest privilege of her life.
But as it turned out, what Ruth had in mind for serving God wasn't the same thing Billy had in mind. He was planning on being a pastor, while she had long wanted to be a missionary.
Later, Mr. Graham would say, quite interestingly and with a bit of humor, that she tried so hard in those early months to convince him to be a missionary to Tibet. He would tell her that he didn't feel like God was calling him to do that, and she would counter by saying, well, then I need to marry someone who's willing to go to Tibet. On the day she said that, he asked for his ring back. But then he says she wouldn't take it off, and she wouldn't let me take it off, and so right there she decided, I'll marry this man. But of course, behind all of this is the wonderful hand of a loving God who brought together these two strong people. He could see ahead what would lie ahead for them in ways they couldn't dare to dream in 1943.
1943 is the year Billy Graham and Ruth Bell got married, August 13th, to be exact, in the small town of Montreat, North Carolina.
Now, later, that would become a special place for them because within a few years, they would move to Montreat, and they would live out the rest of their lives in this wonderful part of North Carolina where their 5 children would be born and from which he would leave to touch a world with his gospel preaching.
Through the window, I see you waiting. You are smiling, 'cause I'm coming. Your eyes are a story, an ocean of memories, pictures of faces and places, and all of the things that make us feel like we have it all.
David Bruce will be back in just a moment. Billy and Ruth Graham's granddaughter, Sissy Graham Lynch, recently shared some memories of her grandparents with us, and here's some of what she shared.
What I loved was that any time my grandmother walked into the room, my grandfather's blue eyes would twinkle and sparkle. The joy that my grandmother brought to my grandfather was so sweet and so tender. Growing up, I knew their marriage was not perfect, but I witnessed 2 people who worked hard at their marriage and committing it to the Lord. One thing I thought was special was with my grandfather's hectic schedule, with coming and going, was that when they were home, they were having devotions together. Maybe sometimes they were reading the same passage and sharing what each other was learning, but sometimes it was just sitting in the presence together, opened up with their own Bibles and reading God's Word together. And I always thought that was so sweet. They enjoyed being in each other's presence and in the presence of the Lord. When I watched my grandparents in the later years of their lives, it was hard for the 2 of them to communicate. My grandfather had a hard time hearing, and my grandmother had a hard time speaking. But I watched the 2 continue to grow in their love for one another, even in the later days of their lives. And I learned that so many times as couples, we think we have to fill the silence with communication and always talking to make a perfect love in a marriage. But I witnessed with these 2 who could no longer communicate very well, that sometimes more was said when less was said. And I am so thankful for the example that they set